Greetings, and welcome to another several hours long break from the merciless pain that is our modern world. Do you like that?
I did. I enjoyed that.
This is Genre Grinder, and I am your host, Gabe Powers. And with me today is my stalwart friend in marathoning movies, Patrick Ripoll.
Hi, how's it going?
Pretty good. I was quite sick, so hopefully I won't have to pause to blow my nose or have a coughing fit. If I do, I'll try to cut it out.
Yeah, we weren't sure we were going to make this recording because you were just, gagging and coughing all day.
Yeah. Enough about me and my bodily functions. So this is another of what we're basically doing, an annual exploration of a specific genre, the year it peaked, when there was the most output. And so recently, I'm saying annual, but we actually just did one of these for giant monster movies of, now I forget the year,
1957.
We just did that. We did one. The first one of these was the slasher movies of 1981, and that was before
That's right.
That was before we planned it to be a series. Then we did something sort of related that was horror movies of 1960, which wasn't the year that the most horror movies came out, but it was sort of a turning point year. And we did the giallo movies of 1971. So now
I was trying to remember. I couldn't remember if it was 71 or 72.
Yeah, it was 71 is what I finally landed on.
Excellent.
And so now we're doing the spaghetti westerns of 1968. And I was, nervous about doing spaghetti western episode because it's sort of, along with giallo and Italian horror, maybe one of those few things that people might know me for online, because it's been like 25 years. I don't for a second think I'm famous enough for most people to know me, but if you know me, it was probably for one of those things. And these full year episodes are, I think, a good introduction, because there are so many spaghetti westerns, and you could break it down by parts, or you could do it this way and just do a bunch of them at once.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think there were more spaghetti westerns in 1968 than any of the other previous peak year episodes we've done?
I'm pretty sure.
Because Giant Monsters, I think there was like 13 movies. I think it was like 17 for slashers. I forget Giallo.
Giallo was in the 20s, I think.
And then about how many spaghetti westerns do you think came out in 1968?
Well, I tried to do, and I actually, really quickly, I want to verify, this is the most year. It ended up kind of being a problem because the best year would have been either 66 or 67. So we're going to cover two of what I think are the best all time, but we're not going to cover a lot of other. And there's some pretty mediocre movies here, some that I'm pretty sure Patrick even hated. I don't think I hate any of them, but yeah, it's a good balance. And anyway, I looked into it, I did the math, and my list included 77 movies.
That is, I mean, this is, if you look at the history of film and you're like, what are most movies? Like, most movies are westerns.
Yeah.
If you're just going by numbers, they, especially in the early days of Hollywood, in the silent era and in the early sound era as well, this was the genre that was extremely cheap to make, and you could just crank them out endlessly on a near weekly basis.
Yeah, think about any time someone complains about some genre kind of taking over mainstream film, like superhero movies, or like there's disaster movies. There's like those periods where, like, oh my god, we had 2 movies about going to Mars. What the fuck, Hollywood? Did you run out of ideas? They made 77 westerns in Italy or Spain around this time.
77 westerns in Italy or Spain, but only one gunshot sound effect that you hear in all of them.
Technically 2. There's one for a revolver, and there's a different one for a rifle.
That is, so I went into this not as an expert in spaghetti western, and one of my big takeaways was, boy, that one sound effect gets real irritating if you watch a bunch of these in a row.
Well, and it's similar to late 60s and 70s kung fu movies where there's just 2 punch sounds over and over and over. Which are ironically enough a lot of times actually the sound of gunfire being altered. So
that makes sense.
They're also gun sounds. Hold on, I'm going to clear my throat with a nice cold refreshing gulp of Coca-Cola Classic, who is a sponsor. yeah, I got $20,000 to do that, and you don't get any of it, Patrick.
That's okay. You did all the hard work.
I drank the soda.
You
Um,
did the extremely non-committal.
uh,
Yeah, I don't know. They might
um,
want their money back on that one.
but another point to make here is that the fad of spaghetti westerns sparked in 1964 with Fistful of Dollars, which wasn't the first Italian or European western, but it was such a big hit that then everybody had to follow that. So within 4 years, we've peaked, and it starts to steadily decline after this, and to the point where by 1970 you're either making giallo movies or you're starting to see a lot of the Polizio Tesci cop movies, cops and robbers movies are kind of what takes over for spaghetti westerns, because I guess they could live alongside giallo. Those are different enough genres, but it's quite the burn. It's just like a flame out of epic proportions that you have within 4 years. You've hit your peak and are dropping off.
And I do think like by doing all of these peak year episodes, we have sort of come to realize that that is the way of the world. Is that
Yeah,
the slasher movie, booms starts with Halloween in '78, and then by the time you get to like 1983, it's already sort of just a self parody.
yeah.
Giant monster movies sort of first came into the fore from the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which I think is '54, and then by the time you get to '58, they're done with them. Giallo, I think, was a hardier thing, but you would be a better
It
judge of
was a
that
little
than
more.
I.
It was a little more malleable, I think, because you could turn them into
Mm,
horror movies. You could turn them into
sure.
slasher movies. Yeah,
Especially when we in 2025 look back at lists of giallo films, what we're really looking back at is lists of films that critics have determined have that giallo flavor more than
yeah.
like a western is like, okay, no, everyone involved making this movie was thinking, yeah, this is a cowboy horse movie.
Yeah. Yeah, the other term is odors. I like that term, as in the oats that the horses eat. I always liked referred to westerns as odors.
Never
Because sometimes
heard
you have to
that one.
curl 'em. Yeah, you never heard that one? Yeah, I like that one. And
No.
cowboy western also helps because like western could mean some other thing. But we know what, yeah, exactly. We know what and also the point of the giallo and slasher movies all turning into self parody. These also did. And that was the last almost 10 years of spaghetti westerns were comedies, really mostly awful comedies, and a couple movies that were sort of meta about the whole thing, which we actually start to get into already by 1968. We're having all these referential things. So this is not the best year for movies overall, but it is a good year for what was going to happen shortly after. That will come up a lot, even in some of the less good movies that we're going to cover. Um, but I also want to make sure what my definition, because Patrick doesn't know, he doesn't know what he's talking about here. My
True.
definition of a spaghetti western, and this may differ from other people's, because I've seen lists of spaghetti westerns that include the spaghetti western database online actually listed over 100 movies for 1968, and I looked through them and I determined 77 tops, because I think that the following criteria needs to be followed to be, quote, a spaghetti western. You need to have one of the following three things. One, it needs to be filmed by an Italian crew or at least made under an Italian director. Two, it needs to have been shot in Spain, preferably Almeria, where a series of very recognizable sets were erected and utilized through dozens of these films. The same thing that happens with Shaw Brothers kung fu movies. You see the same storefront over and over and over again. Spaghetti westerns, you see the same storefront, you see the same street over and over and over again. And then three, it needs to feature and preferably star an actor or actors who are specifically famous for being in spaghetti westerns, and they are often Americans, but sometimes also Italians, Spaniards, English, German. There's a one German in particular here, or Swedish actors. If you have at least one of these things, I'm going to count it as a spaghetti western. Every movie we're covering has at least two.
If you don't
So,
have those things, then it's just a sparkling odor.
yeah. Well, something like, we'll say Hanny Calder, made in Europe by Europeans, not shot in Spain, not under Italian filmmakers, doesn't really feature any, unless you're counting Ernest Borgnine has appeared in a couple spaghetti westerns, maybe. but I don't really think of Handy Calder as a spaghetti western.
So I decided to double check my claim there, and it turns out that Handy Calder was shot in Spain on some of the same sets that spaghetti westerns are shot on. So it does actually meet my standard as a spaghetti western. So ignore it any other time I mention it as not a spaghetti western, because I suppose it just barely makes it. Okay.
So it's arguable. There's a debate to be had. We're not going to do that today. That was just me setting this up for us.
Sure.
And in the past, we've covered these in release order. And if we did that, one of the two really important ones would be the second thing we talked about. So I've moved what I consider the two most important ones to the very end of the list. I think my last note before we get started is that I want to say that besides IMDb and Wikipedia, I've gotten most of the information I know about these movies from Alex Cox's 10,000 Ways to Die in the West, Howard Hughes, not that one, his Once Upon a Time in the Italian West, and Tom Weissler, or I guess Weissers, perhaps? Thomas Weissers, Spaghetti Westerns, The Good, the Bad, and the Violent, and Western all'Italiana, The Specialist by Antonio Bruscini and Antonio Tintori. So, anything else intro wise you need to say, Patrick?
Oh yeah. We sort of hinted at this, but Gabe asked me to be on this just because these are the episodes we have been doing together. But this is closer to the Giallo episode we did than the slasher movie or giant monster movie episodes we did, which is to say that this is not my subgenre of choice. I have seen spaghetti westerns I really enjoyed before this episode, preparing for this episode. Like I had, Good, Mad, the Ugly is one of the greatest films of all time. I really like Day of Anger. But Companeros kicks ass. But like generally speaking, this is not what I turn to. I'm a fan of westerns. I am not a western expert in the world of Hollywood westerns either. But in the realm of Hollywood westerns, there are definitely filmmakers like Anthony Mann, who I'm in love with, Bud Bedecker, like some of the early, especially the earlier films of Sam Peckinpah, like Ride the High Country and stuff like that. I'm really a big fan of. So not like totally ignorant about westerns, but generally speaking, no kind of expert.
He's our color commentator for this one.
Yeah, I'm
I
the
kind of
I'm like I'm the normal guy. I'm the person who falls into the fantasy world, and Gabe has to explain all of the spaghetti western tropes to me, and then I'm the audience surrogate.
yeah,
This is
yeah.
this is a spaghetti western isekai
I was gonna say it's an
podcast.
isekai. We just talked about that in the last episode with Betsy. Yeah, I wanted the 1957 monster movie one to be me being the color commentator, but we need to find something that I do not know. I don't know what though, and it ended up being something neither of us know, and we both learned things. I learned
Sure.
stuff though. I hadn't seen a couple of these movies. I tried to make sure I picked a couple I had never seen, but I also did try to pick movies that either had good reputations or fit some sort of role in
And
the
generally
bigger picture.
speaking, I will say there are two movies here I think are bad, and then everything else I enjoyed or loved.
I mean, that's fair. I'm pretty middling on. I'll say I'll try to be honest on these. I think I enjoy most of them, but I'll try to be honest as far as quality goes. So yeah, so with that said, we start on what I would call mediocre note, which is Django Prepara Coffin, and I'm going to butcher all the Italian here. So I'm going to say it to Patrick, and then I'm probably going to overdub it with a computer pronouncing it correctly. But this is directed by Ferdinando Baldi, and its Italian title is
Preparati la bara.
and is also known as Viva Django. And I think this is a good place to start because it tells us where the genre is at in 1968 and how saturation can breed either innovation or mediocrity. So I know that we've been talking about this for a month. I know that this one was not one of your favorites, and I'm not particularly protective of it. I think it's pretty good. I like the story idea behind it. The basic plot here is a mysterious gunfighter named Django, and that we'll come to that in a second. Is employed by local crooked politician by local crooked political bosses as a hangman to execute innocent locals framed by the boss who wants their land. What the boss doesn't know is that Django isn't hanging the men at all, just making it look like he is, and then using the men he saves from the gallows as his own gang in order to get revenge. I think that's a pretty cool idea for a story.
Yeah.
Um,
Did you
the I
mention that Django's whole family was murdered by this guy?
Yes, and that's yeah. So it's a long game revenge story.
Oh boy, is it a long game. Let me tell
It's
you
a
a little
very
something about the movies I did and did not like in prepping for this podcast. I think when these movies have a real sense of tension and narrative drive, the fact that they are a little bit silly and a little bit light on psychology like does not matter, and I'm able to like vibe with it. And then there are movies like Django Prepare a Coffin where offhand someone mentions that this very roundabout revenge plan has been going on for 5 years. And he has like a whole ghost town of people that he has not actually executed. And they're all just like hanging around there for 5 years so they can eventually be part of his revenge plan. Like they have lives, but they just
yeah.
apparently don't care. There's multiple points throughout this movie where what you are like is what you want is Django to shoot the bad guy who killed his wife and family, and he has the opportunity to, and he does not because he's setting up some kind of super elaborate revenge. And you're like, oh, this is going to be really good. And what he does is he shoots the bad guy at the end of the movie.
He just needed to make sure the bad guy understood how clever and committed he was.
That is the other thing about this movie is the bad guy really does not understand because he murders Django's entire family and then spends the rest of the movie going, but come on, man, you're going to work with me, right? And Django's like, no, you murdered my entire family. All I want is for you to die. And he goes, I could kill you now because you just threatened me, but I think you're going to come around and want to be my henchman. And so this is a movie that has like really, really low. It should be the highest narrative stakes, but because both parties, the protagonist and antagonist, are so freaking leisurely with how they go about everything, it I really did not enjoy just sort of feeling stranded in this story. Revenge plots are supposed to sort of just be a shortcut to like motivation and momentum. And it's like, actually, we don't need to do a lot of play setting to tell a story because dude's family got killed. He's going to kill the people who killed his family. We all know what this thing is. Django Prepare a Coffin cleverly says, yes, but what if instead it wasn't that? And yeah, not a fan of this one.
Yeah, well, I think that critically speaking, I would say that this is a really good idea with the right cast. That they just didn't figure out a screenplay for. Like, I think somebody along the line said, "Hey, what if there's a guy who's pretending to be a hangman who is slowly building a gang to get revenge on all these people who were hung?" And the idea that all these people that you assume are dead show back up to kill you is a pretty frightening thing if you're a villain. And I just feel like they didn't get it together in the story. So it has the concept, has the look, has the cast, doesn't have the story
Yeah.
to make it work is the way I would describe it. Going back to the name Django, it depends on which cut you're watching or which dub you're watching. If his name is Django or not. And one of the things that this is a product of is that there are possibly hundreds of European westerns that carry the name Django in their title in some capacity, especially German and Asian releases of movies, all because Sergio Corbucci's 1966 film Django was massively popular worldwide. It actually came up when you and I, way back when we talked about The Harder They Come,
Yeah.
that they are watching Django in a theater. It was actually a huge hit in Jamaica. Across, it was appealed to everybody. Really super violent revenge movie that is also a very elaborate scheme, but was very much trying to. It was basically an adaptation of Yojimbo, just like Fistful of Dollars. So a lot of these Django movies are just Yojimbo again. So part of what I liked about this one the first time I saw it is it wasn't Yojimbo, and it felt like it might have worked if it had been written better. It might have actually worked as a prequel to Django because we don't know a lot about Django's backstory, which is part of the appeal, honestly. But the idea that it's sort of like, how prequels have a way of like describing this is how the person you think is cool, how they got their jacket. And you're like, we don't give a fuck why they got their
Right.
jacket.
Right.
This is how Django got his coffin with a machine gun in it. This is the backstory of how that happened. And that when we watch this, and then we watch Django, the movie Django, and he has done this murder, and he's just going about his business to go do some other revenge thing. If you use your imagination, at the very least, the climax of this is an escalation of the machine gun reveal and then adding that to the climax of Django, where he has his hands crushed and he needs to use a cross to shoot the bad guy at the end. Anyway,
I like Django, but it did not
well,
occur to
everybody
me.
likes Django.
Yeah, it did not occur to me that this would be a prequel. I thought it because again, it's an Italian movie,
Yeah,
so Italians will just title something. Oh,
yeah.
like, oh yeah, this is part of that series and has nothing to do with anything. So the name Django did not to me clue did not clue
No,
me
no,
in that this was a Django movie.
and this is me being a nerd. This is me trying to connect things that
I see.
aren't really. This is really just a couple. This is again, you have a good idea for a story, and then you're like, well, what do we do with it? Well, let's just rip off two of the set pieces from Django and at the end of the movie, but make them bigger than they were in Django. And just for some backstory that I think is funny, since we don't have a lot to tell about the content of this film, this movie was developed by the Django's producer, Manolo Bulganini, and it was written by Django co-writer Franco Rossetti, and it was even intended as part of this 3-film deal that they made with Django star Franco Nero. And of those films, Nero made Django and Texas Adios, which was the same director, Baldi's first Western. But then he fucked off to Hollywood almost immediately after scoring a hit, broke his contract, and he appeared in John Huston's The Bible, The Beginning, and Joshua Logan's Camelot, which he's famously badly cast in Camelot because it's a musical, and his English, although his English was good, his accent was really thick. So there was this whole thing where like they had to figure out they needed a Django because their star ran away. He did eventually return, and he hooked up with Bolognese again, and they made Luigi Bazzoni's The Fifth Chord, which we covered in the Giallo episode. So this movie sort of has, like, if this movie had starred him, he might not have been in The Fifth Chord in some way. So there is things that Patrick will like about this movie if I tell him that.
I mean,
Because
hey, you want to know a good thing about this movie? The stunt work on the one robbery scene. There's some good sequences. I mean, in general, like spaghetti westerns, they are more about gunfights than like the Hollywood films of the previous decade
yeah,
that I'm familiar with. I've probably seen many more westerns from the 50s than the 60s. But when I think about like 50s Hollywood westerns, it's not nearly as much shootouts as in a spaghetti western. And sometimes that means, even a bad movie had some good stunt work. Guy falls off of a stagecoach running at top speed. There's like a shootout where there's a saloon that gets set on fire and there's a really long fire stunt. Stuff like that is, it's not terrible.
no. Well, Baldi, I would say he's a good example of I would say Tonino Valeri is the best solid, just middle of the road, can make you a good movie Western director of these that like doesn't really excel in any way. But Baldi is pretty close, and he hooked up with an American actor named Tony Anthony, who was trying to do his own Man with No Name thing with the Stranger movies they're called, and they actually made a movie called Blind Man, which I think is their best, and has Ringo Starr as a genuinely frightening villain. I highly recommend that movie, especially if you're a Beatles fan.
Yeah, that
Uh,
sounds like an achievement.
yeah, it's pretty cool. And then they made Coming at Ya in 1981, which is one of the early movies in that 3D movie fad of the early 80s that included Friday the 13th 3D. Anyway, he going back to Nero, when they couldn't find Nero, they found this other actor who does look in this particular movie a lot like Franco Nero. If you dress him like him and you kind of give him the makeup, his name is Terrence Hill. His real name is Mario Girodi. He was a minor star in historic dramas and peplums of the era, and he had leading roles in God Forgives, I Don't, and Little Rita of the West, also Little Rita of the West, which is a musical vehicle for pop star Rita Pavone, or Pavone, I guess she's Italian. But he had been doing pre Fistful of Dollars German westerns at the time. And so he was brought on just because of his passing resemblance to Nero, and then arguably became a bigger star not too long after this because he was in Enzo Barboni's Trinity movies. Trinity, they call me Trinity. Trinity is still my name. And he ended up hooking up with his Trinity co-star Bud Spencer, who we'll talk about way later in this podcast, probably episode 2 or 3, because they hooked up and they became this team, Spencer and Hill, and were super popular in these terrible Western and police comedies. So there's sort of interesting. Franco Nero led this guy to be a superstar, and it wasn't the only time that happened. There was another series of movies where they couldn't get Franco Nero to come back and do them, so they found a lookalike, and that guy then became a bigger star in the cop movies. But what's funny about that to me, again, as a nerd, is that at this time, and everything was renamed Django for international releases. Every hero, a lot of the movies we're covering here have Django in the title if they have a singular lead character. Then after this, Trinity became the name, so they started titling old Terrence Hill movies to be Trinity this, Trinity that, even if he's not playing Trinity and they're not comedies. So that
this is why this is why the Italian titles, they mean nothing to me.
Yeah. So like, yeah, I mean, and yeah, that's the funny thing. You could have movie is called Blank, aka Django and Blank, aka Trinity and Blank, and it's a funny thing. And it really, and you get the Italians get they're the ones who people laugh at for this, but it really wasn't them doing it. It was really the other European countries that wanted another Django or Trinity movie. So the Italian title usually has nothing to do with Django or Trinity. Again, I like the idea behind this movie. I like the idea of a Dirty Dozen team. That's something that's going to come up other times. I think that the Dirty Dozen was a really big influence on not just Italian war movies, but Italian westerns. There is an attempt at tragic irony here, and that the plan falls apart because he goes off to save the wife of one of his guys, and that exact guy is the one who messes everything up, but he does it for possibly the right reasons. Like there's a better chance at some melodrama there that isn't really, the extra irony being that he had saved this guy from his more loyal gang members earlier in the film. And there is a intriguing moral dilemma here that they can't pull off, where Django realizes that he doesn't really realize this, but he sort of realizes that he is now exploiting the people who had been exploited in the first place. Like if you had a smarter, more politically minded filmmaker like Sergio Solima or Sergio Corbucci doing this movie, they would have definitely done something with the fact that the indigenous Mexican guy is the betrayer, and it's because he's being exploited by Django, and Django figures that out, and Django even gives him a chance to live at the end. And there's the possibility of a really good movie here, and I think maybe that's what makes it more frustrating, is that they can't grasp the good ideas they have.
I think something that I have noticed, watching these movies, is that the spaghetti westerns are sort of nominally, like, vaguely leftist in sentiment.
It depends on the filmmaker. Some filmmakers are very leftist in sentiment, but yeah, most of them are vaguely, I would say.
I think that, especially for a genre like the Western, where in America it was a very conservative genre because it was the sort of myths that we told ourselves about how America was founded and how that was like an inevitable thing, and about the like hard, brave people it took to settle the wild land and all of the racial connotations that go with that. And these spaghetti westerns are like utterly disinterested with America as a concept or anything like that. Like the America that these movies take place in is extremely vague and almost wuxia like.
Mm-hmm.
you don't get a sense of like this town is this many miles away from this major city. That they all just kind of exist in this netherworld. But I think that the flip side of that is that they, because they are interested in these anti-heroes and these sort of morally complicated sort of protagonists, they are going to, just in the nature of telling these stories, side with the individual over the institutions and the corporations. And there's just an instant distrust of all of the people who are in charge of everything in a way that is not necessarily a given when you're talking about the films of Hollywood.
And there's another thing that's going on too that will come up later, where a lot of the times the anti-heroes are Confederate soldiers. Most of these movies take place just quickly after the Civil War has ended. Is a very popular time period, in part because The Good, the Bad, the Ugly took place as this war was ending. But it's not because, and this is the theory. Nobody really asked anybody about this, but the academic theory is that the Italian filmmakers are coding their anti-heroes as Southern, because at this point in Italian history there is we're at the early stages of the Years of Lead, which is this horrible, highly volatile, very violent political upheaval in Italy. And the people of the south of Italy they're considered the poor and the put upon, where the people in the north of Italy are considered the bourgeois. And so they are coding the South without really considering what the Confederacy was, because they don't care, because it doesn't matter to them.
Sure.
And and not to say that they won't, some of these filmmakers and people weren't racists who probably thought horrible things about black people, but that wasn't what they were going for here.
Right. In fact, in one of these movies, there's, one of the major plot elements is that a heist is able to take place because of the innate racism of Americans. And it takes a
Mm-hmm.
European to be like, hey, why don't we just not be racist?
Yeah.
And then the other thing that is the byproduct of the Italians being disinterested in the sort of like founding of America myths is that there is a whole lot less indigenous Americans in these movies.
Yeah.
And thus a whole lot less problematic portrayals of indigenous Americans in these movies.
They really stick to Mexicans.
Mm-hmm.
They're really into that idea, and again, that is in part because in 1966 you had these movies that we refer to as Zapata westerns, that were made by card carrying communist filmmakers like The Big Gun Down and Bullet for the General, that were using the Mexican Revolution as a metaphor for their own politics. And because those movies were popular, less political movies are like, well, the Mexican Revolution, that's the time to exploit. So yeah, you have a lot of Mexicans, and I think, fortunately, Spaniards are better at pulling off playing Mexicans than natives. But some of them are indigenous Mexicans, and clearly Spaniards aren't Mexican. But it's the 60s.
Sure.
So, the only other thing about this movie is that this is our first introduction to very tall goon named George Eastman, and a villain, the Horst Frank villain. Which what did you just say when we were talking before this?
Horst he has resting cattle baron face.
Yeah, he said this is a genre of faces, and he has resting cattle baron face.
He just looks Aryan, and he has these like sort of sunken eyes a little bit, and he just looks like an aristocrat.
And judgmental one at that.
Yeah. So he is just sort of like an ideal villain for all of these movies. And then, of course, there is one other very important aspect of Django Prepare a Coffin, which is the incredible score.
Yes. Oh shit! I didn't even put notes on that. Yes. So if you watch this movie for the first time, actually, if you're interested, stop the podcast, go watch the opening titles, then come back to the podcast and tell me what you think you're hearing in those opening titles. Okay. All right, are you back? All right, Patrick. What is the opening titles? Why are they famous?
They're famous because they were sampled by Danger Mouse as part of his Gnarls Barkley project with CeeLo for their massive hit song "Crazy."
Yeah, and it's great because it's a sample. It's a clever sample, so it's not exact. But like, the first time you hear the title in this movie, if assuming you would or watching it recently, you're like, why do I recognize this? What is this? And it took me much longer than I want to admit to figure out what it was sampled on, but it's pretty great. It's a
Yeah,
good score
I
overall.
have written in my notes, Gnarls Barkley crazy, let's go. I was very excited.
Okay, so moving on to one I hadn't seen. This is one of the few I had not seen. The Ruthless Four, directed by Giorgio Capitani. Um, the Italian title is
Ognuno per sé.
the alternate title is Every Man for Himself, which is a better title, I think. The thing on Letterboxd says, in the tradition of the Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which in the tradition of is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. This is the Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is why I picked it, because Patrick and I had just done the monster movie thing, and the movie The Cyclops is also the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. So I have this hope that every time we do one of these, I can find an adaptation of the Treasure of the Sierra Madre and
It shouldn't
squeeze
be
it in
that
there.
hard. Somewhere out there's a slasher movie that's the Treasure
There's
of the
got to
Sierra
be,
Madre.
or
I
like a
every subgenre has to have its take on the same way like every auteur has to have their Hitchcock movie. I feel like every subgenre has to have at least Treasure of the Sierra Madre entry.
there's got to be a samurai movie. There's got to be. I'm just not thinking of it, but there has to be a samurai movie that is just the Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
For real.
There's probably a Yakuza movie too. But yeah, we'll look into that. We'll put a pin in that. In the Alex Cox book, he has these kind of fun insights. He says this is Treasure of Sierra Madre in reverse because the protagonist loses everything except the gold in the end. So
Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah, I did not put that together. That's interesting.
it's just a more nihilistic version of the Treasure of Sierra Madre. It's a pretty nihilistic movie in general. The other reason I picked this one is because it's sort of famous for its homoerotic subtext. And there are these two characters played by Klaus Kinski and George Hilton. This is our first George Hilton movie, and our first Klaus Kinski. He's going to show up again. That they're in this toxic, psychopathic relationship that is never spoken outright, but is very clearly. It's not even really subtext.
This is a more psychological spaghetti western than most of the other entries on the list here.
Yeah,
This is about a guy who is a loser and is sort of known as a loser, and like part of the reason he's in such a desperate situation is that he's kind of willing himself to believe his long lost son, is like on his side, just because it would be just too pathetic otherwise.
yeah,
Um, so it is this like sort of long, his character arc is kind of like this long walk to realize that like his son has betrayed him and that he can't trust him. But it has that desperation of I'm poor and I have a ticket to make it rich, I just like have to do something extraordinary to make it happen. But then it also has that like, it ties that into I am alone and sad, and everyone just kind of pities me and laughs at me, and I need
mhm,
to prove to myself that my life was not a total waste. And I think Van Heflin is very good in this movie.
yeah,
In a
yeah,
way, with a specific kind, like there's a lot of really good performances in spaghetti westerns that are just like, goddamn, I'll watch Lee Van Cleef squint at anything. But it's not
yeah.
necessarily complicated or rich characters that they're crafting. And this is one where I think Van Heflin is a really interesting protagonist.
And he is one of these people that Sergio Leone was famous for trying to bring in people like Lee Van Cleef from Hollywood that he had seen in 50s westerns and TV shows. And Van Heflin was in Shane and 310 to Yuma and The Raid. And I think that he is specifically William Holden-esque in this movie, which makes me think, I mean, the title kind of also makes me think this, but I think that they had Wild Bunch in mind as a tonal thing, not as a story thing. And that there is a world where this is what Italian westerns was Italian versions of American films. And that this one doesn't have a lot of that wacky cool style, and so it starts kind of slow, but it has these ways of dealing with that sort of peck and paw thing. The homoeroticism is another peck and paw thing that shows up in the Wild Bunch in a different way, but it's got interesting ideas, and like you said, it's psychologically it's interested psychologically in its characters more than most of these movies are theme and tone. This one has a little bit more psychology to it. Yes, that's a good way of putting it. That's basically what I have in my notes here too. I think this one also works with the suspense. It only has a couple action scenes, but they are really well blocked, and,
Agreed.
and there's a sense of geography that's missing from, I mean, modern movies in particular, but also from a lot of spaghetti westerns. A lot of the times, it's just people shooting at each other and falling off of things, whereas the director goes out of his way to set up exactly where they are. Like it's like a quarry where the mine is, and he sets up where every single thing. And it really reminded me of a set piece in Red Dead Redemption 2, where you have to go into a quarry and fight off some guys. And it was like the setup was so similar that I wouldn't be surprised if those guys watched this, because they took a bunch of, I don't know, they took a bunch of ideas and music from spaghetti westerns. So I should say that one filmmaking issue that's not great here is that there is a lot of indecipherable day for night sequences. Uh,
Mm.
the Italians loved day for night shooting. I assume it was because it was a way of getting more stuff done. Uh, and if you're
It's
not
very
watching,
expensive to shoot when there is no natural light out and you're not in like an urban area.
exactly, and so it's one of these things where if you're not watching a good, I found a half decent uh version of this that I think is the one Patrick also watched. I can't remember, did you watch the one I put up on? No, that's right. The one I found had a couple deleted scenes. It was a slightly longer cut.
Yeah, I saw the shorter one that's on Tubi, but it didn't seem to be significantly affected.
Yeah, it's so, yeah, there's a little bit of problem with that, but they do love those day for night scenes. The writer is a more famous character here than the director. I don't really know Capitani's work very much outside of this. This is his only Western, and the rest of his movies seem to be melodramas, which I guess tracks because this is sort of a melodrama. But it was written by Fernando de Leo, who is better known as writer director of Polizio Tesci during the 70s. He might even be like the Polizio Tesci auteur in some circles. But he did a lot of uncredited script work for like every major spaghetti western, beginning with Fistful of Dollars. And you just go down the line and you read his uncredited script authoring stuff. It's just everything. And he did work on Fulci's first Western, Massacre Time. And apparently, DeLeo was also powerful enough that he was picking the director, and this was supposed to be another Fulci film. And the producers didn't want Fulci. And I could see Fulci making this already nihilistic movie just an absolute banger of a bummer movie
Yeah,
if he had
yeah.
taken control of it, because Massacre Time is a pretty standard issue action movie, but like, man, by the time you get to Four of the Apocalypse, Jesus Christ, it's just like, it's intense stuff, and that's what Fulci was doing. I don't know if he would have done it this early, something that dark, but it was what he did that was interesting.
Going
Well,
back just a moment, I just had to look at my notes because I was struggling to remember what the climax of this one was and if I was
mhm,
mixing it up. But this is the one that it has the climax where it's this like shootout on this cliffside and it's all these like rocky outcroppings and they're like going into like little nooks and sort of ducking out of sight and everything. That shootout is extremely Anthony Mann. Anthony Mann loved to have a climax of a movie that was like all about a shootout involving elevation
mhm,
and like staging action in terms of multiple people trying to flank each other and not knowing where they are, and like that was sort of his bread and butter when it came to uh, closing a western, and even some of his noir films. It's like a shoot. It's the same thing, but instead of a mountain, it's a like a tenement building's staircase. Um, and I think the thing that for me always like defined one of the things that defined Anthony Mann's westerns is that he was such a good director of action and he did really understand how to build suspense and tension using during a gunfight, using like lines of sight and cover and that sort of thing. And I do think both the shootout in the sort of abandoned mission and the climax of this film are like, oh, okay, this is like Anthony Mann to me.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, it's like there's two solid shootout action scene, but when you have two really good ones, it's so much more impactful than if you have like a dozen kind of shitty ones,
Right.
which happens in your worst Italian westerns all the time. And well, the Anthony Mann connection is also Gilbert Roland, the Mexican actor Gilbert Roland, whose real name is Luis Antonio Damaso de Alonso. He's in The Furies, which is my favorite Anthony Mann movie, which is the least Anthony Mann-esque of those movies. I don't know, there's just no shootouts in that movie. But
It's a very different. I mean, that's one of the funny things about westerns is like when you talk about spaghetti westerns, you really are talking about movies that are of a type.
yeah,
They go in different directions, and there's different little pockets of the Zapata western and this and that. But like generally speaking, they have a certain sensibility, especially when you group them all in a single year like this. But like westerns in general is subject matter almost more than like tropes sometimes. Like
yeah,
the idea that the Searchers and the Oxbow incident are like the same genre is like kind of silly, but they
yeah.
both have pistols and cowboy hats, so they are both westerns. And
And
the
yeah, like
Furies is definitely one of those where it's like the Furies is almost like a Shakespearean like King Lear sort of a tale. It just happens to be on a ranch.
on a ranch, yeah, yeah. But so I think that your connections here are good though, because like why else would they hire Roland if they hadn't seen some Anthony Mann movies?
And at this
Um,
point, by 1968, Anthony Mann's reputation. I mean, I think 1968 might have been the year Anthony Mann made his last film. I think the oh gosh, it was one of those spy movies, like British spy movies. But Anthony Mann was one of those Hollywood filmmakers that was embraced by the European critics as being an auteur and being someone who worked inside of the studio system but had like personal vision. And so like he was not someone who was undiscovered and that people at this time would not be thinking about as an artist.
his last movie was called The Dandy Aspic.
That's right. The Dandy
Same
Aspect, I
year.
think, came out the
Came
same year.
out
Yeah.
came out in December, so just a little bit after this movie, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, a lot after at the end of the year. But actors in general are good in this movie too. I mean, you have Klaus Kinski. For those who don't know, who a lot of people probably don't know, he was in a lot of spaghetti westerns,
Mm-hmm.
and he was not. There's not a lot of backstory of him fighting with people on spaghetti westerns, and I don't know why that is. I think he thought of them as just a job, and so he just came in. And I think that a lot of these directors, because there was a language barrier on top of everything else, the thing that the weird about some spaghetti westerns is that there's such a big international cast that they're not even actually speaking lines at each other. Sometimes they would just have people go up and count so that they could have the timing correct, and it would all be written out in the dubbing. This is not one of those cases. These are actors actually dubbing themselves, which makes a big difference in the performance quality too. But Kinski really excelled at playing weirdos, and the Italians loved the weirdos he played.
Mm-hmm.
He was not always a villain though, but this is a top of the line performance from him. I think he has 5 costume changes in this movie about people going across the desert in the worst, like nobody else changes clothes once because
Mm-hmm.
they have such limited supplies. Like that's a part. There's a part, one of the scenes that I don't think you saw because it was only in Italian on the cut I saw, is that Kinski's character accidentally drops their supplies off the side of a cliff, and they make him rappel down and pick it up because it's that important. And then they consider just leaving him there, which it comes the irony later being that he's the one who fucks everything up, of course. But
This is one of the classic beats of the Treasure of the Sierra Madre story is they have more gold than they can take, and so they have to make choices about how much they're taking before they go back to civilization with their findings, and like how long can they string along their supplies, and water rationing is like a big part of this movie.
yeah, yeah. And so, in spite of all that, Kinski has like 5 costume changes.
There's something about like he's just that extremely Germanic face, and the fact that he is coded as gay, and the fact that he has all these costume changes and stuff. like he just feels out of place. He feel like he dropped in from a different movie.
Yeah.
As a lot of the villains in these movies are just like either the cattle baron aristocrat types, or they're like just utterly filthy gang leaders. And the idea of this like very sharp man who is very unexpressive, and he does not reveal what he has planned, but he's clearly from the very start, you're like, okay, that's the bad guy. This is the guy who's going to fuck everything up. It's very effective.
And I feel like his relationship with George Hilton is like vampiric in nature.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like he has control over him in a way that is that even George Hilton recognizes is bad, but he can't resist it. Speaking of Hilton, he is a Uruguayan actor, Jorge Acosta y Lara, but he went by George instead of Jorge. And he is in some of the best spaghetti westerns and gialli. He had a fantastic career in Italian exploitation movies. He's typically a soft-spoken Eastwood type character, or a sort of smoldering guy in gialli movies, like in Sergio Martino's The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward. He's got a kind of smoldering like danger to him. And then he had just been in Fulci's Massacre Time, which we talked about, where he is really happy-go-lucky character. But either way, he is cast so much against type as this sort of vulnerable kid in this, that I think this might be his best performance in any of the westerns I've ever seen him in. It's such an interesting, especially if you are used to seeing him in other movies, it's such an interesting portrayal.
For sure.
The score on this one is Carlo, oh boy, Carlo Rusticelli. He did a bunch of Mario Bava movies, and he does a sort of Ennio Morricone impression here, but it feels a little bit more 50s Hollywood. But the cool thing is the title theme is actually Miserlou, the Greek. Well, they say it's a Greek traditional piece, but it seems like it's one of those songs that's so old that everybody claims it was. Like I've read some things that said it was a traditional Jewish piece, but the song made famous by Dick Dale as a surf song.
And surf and spaghetti westerns like that, they are already sort
That
of tied in
guitar,
together.
yeah, that amazing guitar tone that Morricone found is beautiful stuff. Love it.
And you hear constantly throughout all of these 1968 spaghetti westerns that those guitars.
Yeah, love it. God, the best guitar tone ever in history.
There's also a lot of like, and I'm assuming that this is in both versions, but it's possible that this was just in my version. There's a lot of like spooky organ music.
Yeah. Yep.
In this movie, that when you said
that
he worked with Mario Bava, I was like, I can see the score like working on a Baron Blood or something.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, good score. That is everybody's. Most people are trying to be Ennio Morricone at this point, but a lot of the good composers are finding a way of paying homage without just copying. I think is a good way of putting it. That's all I got on this one. You got any other thoughts?
No. This is definitely, this was the first one I watched, and this is still one of my favorites. I think because it is more character driven in the way that I associate with Hollywood westerns, and is my preference for the genre.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the ones I'm going to try to import on Blu-ray now that I've seen it. There's a lot of spaghetti westerns that are only available on German Blu-ray. They were really a big deal in Germany, and I think Germany, along with France, were the two countries that kind of figured out that these were interesting and we should look into them more after the fact.
I feel like it's inevitable that once the Shaw Brothers is tapped out, we're gonna get a new like gold rush of Western releases, or I guess Region A releases of these
it would be
spaghetti
good.
westerns on Blu-ray.
A lot of them don't have copyright. A lot of them, the reason you find so many compilation cheapo DVD compilations is because the copyright in America is messed up. So if you can find a half decent scan, the film itself, which might be sitting, you might not get a negative, but you get something, you could put a pretty good disc, and not have to worry about the copyright infringement, not have to pay off anybody. So I don't know. I think Ruthless Four might be one of them. It might be on one of my DVD collections that I picked up back in the day when I didn't think everybody would be putting them on remastered Blu-ray.
Yeah, that's the other thing. If you listen to this episode and you want to watch some of these, be warned that they're almost all available on streaming services like Tubi or Pluto or stuff like that. But like often, what you're watching is a terrible rip of a VHS that
Yeah.
is a terrible cropping of a widescreen, and it's like, oh, cool! I get a lot of crash zooms into people's noses.
Yes,
Uh,
lovely. The bridge of a nose. Wow. Yeah, I would actually say, in my experience, check YouTube first because there were a lot
yeah,
of European fans that stick up versions on YouTube with subtitles or in English. A lot of times people prefer the English dubs because the lead actors the most of the cast is speaking English on set, even if they're dubbed by different actors. So yeah, I would check YouTube first for some of these. I saw some of them on there. Anyway, moving on to the another one I didn't see, the Bella Starr story. In Italian, it is
Il mio corpo per un poker.
which is my body for a poker. I don't think that that's what they mean. I think that should be my body for like a reward in a poker game. I bet my body maybe is what the better
yeah.
translation would be, but my body for a poker. Uh, so I picked this one in part because I bought it on Blu-ray and hadn't watched it yet. Um, but also because there weren't many spaghetti westerns with female leads. Hell, there aren't many westerns, period, with female leads. And on the European side of things, we got the aforementioned Rita of the West, which was a vehicle for an Italian Swiss singer. We have Lola Colt, which was a vehicle for an African American singer. And again, you might want to count Hanny Calder. I don't. And which we'll eventually talk about Once Upon a Time in the West, which I think is a female co-lead. But what's more interesting here is this is possibly the only spaghetti western directed by a woman, barring pseudonyms or uncredited stuff. I mean, I don't know if you can count the westerns directed by a woman before the year 2010. You could probably count them on two hands. I don't know. It was a very uncommon thing for women to direct films at all in Italy, and it was especially uncommon for them to direct genre stuff. So I kind of picked this movie with that in mind, assuming it might not be good, but just because I wanted there to be some sort of, I it just felt like an important thing. But it's also directed. The director, how do you say it? Lina Wertmüller,
That's
or is
how
it
I've been saying it.
Wertmüller? I didn't do any research on her. I I kind of told Patrick it was his job, and then I forgot about it.
And then I
So
also was just like, oh, it turns out I didn't have time to watch, Seven Beauties and Swept Away or anything. But important Italian auteur, again, I think throughout the world for a very long time, female film directors were very rare. Unlike a lot of arts, film is just an inherently expensive proposition. And the people
yeah,
with the money are men. And so they just instinctually do not trust women with all of that money. So where you have like histories of great, women novelists and painters and musicians and all of this, like it has taken a very long time for women to break into the film industry and break past that misogyny. But Lina Wertmüller was one of those figures in the like art house world, and I didn't get to watch any of these movies nor do a ton of research, but I did like poke around people's letterboxed reviews of some of her most well-known films, and it does seem like Bella Starr story, which is, I think she was a replacement for the original director. I don't think she
oh,
originated
okay,
the project at all.
yeah, because there is a co-director, Piero Cristofani, but he was a second unit guy. This is his only first unit credit. So I was under the impression that that meant that she just let him do some of the action scenes and was either kind enough to give him a co-directing, or because it's a sexist industry, he was forced on it. So, but I don't know a lot about if he was the original director and replaced. That would
I
make more.
believe it was a project that had been going for a week or two, and then the director got replaced with her.
Okay.
But her films have a reputation as being like sort of thorny for modern audiences to watch because they are very specifically about power dynamics and sexual relationships between men and women, and a lot of modern audiences find them to be very misogynist and
Mhm.
sort of challenging in that way, in terms of the power that women have and the power that men have, and sort of her interpretation of the battle of the sexes and stuff like that. Can't speak to it, haven't seen the movie, so I won't try to paraphrase any of those arguments, but that's the vibe I get, and that's definitely what Bella Starr story is.
Well, the one of her movies I had seen was Swept Away, which has this Bella Starr. Swept Away. Well, I think people probably know the horrible Madonna remake.
Right.
The original is pretty rapey, and this movie has some of that going on too, and it is very uncomfortable because there are sexual assaults that are treated as like romance. Basically is that like that's something I feel like needs to be a trigger warning, is that that is part of the central relationship of this movie, is between two people who meet, whose first encounter is a she tries to murder him and then he sexually assaults her, and then they become this sort of weird dynamic relationship, but they're both outlaws, and like she's on his turf but he's in love with her, and it's, yeah, it's very thorny is a good way of putting it.
This is the thing I liked about this movie. I think ultimately, like as a story with like a beginning, middle, and end, it sucks, and it's not necessarily full of a lot of like good action or the kind of things that you're looking for from spaghetti westerns. But I did like that it is essentially an erotic thriller spaghetti western about a like very kinky relationship.
Hmm.
That in itself was novel enough, and I do think that it has conviction about that, which is not necessarily like, there is a lot of casual violence against women in these movies. There is a lot of casual like plot, sexual assault used as a plot point in these movies. 1968, generally, we're not seeing a lot of it on screen. It's more implied. It's the
Yeah.
threat, and then it gets prevented at the last minute, or it's the threat and then off screen it happens and we just sort of know it happened. But this movie seems to like just be genuinely turned on by all of this,
Yeah.
in a way that I found very compelling. I like the idea of George Eastman as this like piece of shit dom. Like, he is just this like massive hulking man with this wild face that is, if you're going to have a erotic fantasy about being put in your place as a woman, I guess it's like he's a compelling guy to do it.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
George Eastman is 6'8",
it's
and
unbelievable.
and he plays a dashing rogue in this one, and it's so against type, and it's sort of fascinating, and he has the biggest earring you've ever seen. Yeah, that just his casting is so weird, and he's really good at it too. Like,
Mhm.
it's really strange. It's really strange, and there's this line at the end of the movie that is a just super good line, which is she says to him, "With you, I always lose, even when I win." And I know that's not necessarily an original line, but it was just such a good distillation of the whole weird relationship that goes on in this film.
This is the appeal of the Bella Starr story, is you get to, as an audience, pick apart what its sexual politics are, because the beginning of the movie is this very masculine woman who is kicking everybody's ass at poker, and she's unflappable, and she's smoking a cigar, and there's all of these men who are just losing their shirts to her because she is just so good at poker, and she cannot be beat. And that setup, at the very least, feels to me like influenced by Rio Bravo. Is it Angie Dickinson is in Rio Bravo?
I think that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Like, her character is a sort of a similar setup. And of course, Howard Hawks is someone who was very interested in gender dynamics and masculine women, and but like the idea of a masculine woman as being an opportunity for an even more masculine man to sort of assert his righteousness. And this is a movie that is about a woman. Like, it opens with a woman doing this really interesting, like, this is part of like the gambling addict mentality, where it's like, the juice isn't when you win money, the juice is when you lose money. That's
Uh-huh.
what sort of gives you that rush. um and she just gets on a losing streak, and she just keeps chasing this losing streak, and then she like starts humiliating herself in this pursuit of this losing streak with George Eastman, eventually putting her body like as the stakes, And then they have this like very harrowing sex scene where he, quote unquote, collects his winnings, and that like establishes their relationship as like he is the one man who is masculine enough to like sort of dominate and overpower and like put her in her place as a woman. And then later you like get her backstory, and she's, in these flashbacks, she's this kind of like a naive country bumpkin of a girl who meets a man who has this similar dynamic with her, maybe a bit more gentle. But then when she has to save this servant that she, had as a child, that's also like her friend, from her uncle sexually assaulting her, then that like she has to sort of harden and become a gang member on the run. And so she like has to live this outlaw life where she can't let anybody in. And so there's this like implication of like maybe this is like what she wants, because she like just has had to put up this really hard front as this outlaw on the run from the law for so long, but also she really hates men who take in
Yeah.
that way. Like she hates that aspect of male sexuality, and so she has this like level of self-loathing over her relationship with George. I mean, it's really fascinating for, again, a story that is like, where does this all go? She's like, George Eastman wants to do a heist, I'm going to ruin his heist. And then at the end of the day, we sort of that kind of fizzles, and then we go, oh well, that didn't work, I guess we're stuck together. Like it kind of falls apart as a story in the last act. But like it's really fun to watch, and especially to know that it was directed by a woman.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. This
you
was
have,
directed, man. You would, yeah.
and that doesn't make it, feminist. Like
No, no, no.
it can be regressive
There are
and
feminist
disgusting.
aspects of it.
Yeah,
In the
but
same
like,
way there are
but
feminist aspects of rape revenge movies, you know? It's
exactly.
yeah.
But I think the fact that it's directed by a woman doesn't make it feminist, but it does mean that if you think of yourself as a feminist, you have to consider it. Like
Yeah.
you have to take it seriously. You can't just write it off. And I think, again, watching so many of these spaghetti westerns where it is just guys firing guns at each other for 40 minutes and it's the same gun sound effect for 40 minutes, like Bella Starr story was like, oh, hold the presses, what is this?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I think I kind of wish we would have covered it later. Like this feels like something that you watch after watching seven of kind of the same movie.
Yeah.
Maybe it's too early in the podcast here, but no, well. Other thing I found interesting about it is that it structurally, it has all these things. Its opening titles are just a fistful of dollar opening titles. Like there's all these things it does that are very spaghetti western. I even think that her specific cigar thing is supposed to be in reference to Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name cigar, but she uses the thingy to be more feminine. The I don't know what you call those clip
Like the
things.
holder.
Yeah, I think that Elsa Martinelli is sort of doing a Eastwood esque thing in a couple scenes too, when she's sort of like putting on the masculine stuff. But what what makes it really interesting, other than all the stuff you just said, is that structurally it's very different from almost any spaghetti western, because there are so many flashbacks, and technically there's flashbacks within flashbacks where she'll be telling George Eastman's character the story of meeting George Hilton's character, and then telling George Hilton's character a story of how she got to where she is now within that same flashback a couple times. Spaghetti westerns used flashbacks, especially revenge westerns, but it was almost always in like stuff like Death Rides a Horse, where there'll be just a literal flashback. Like it will be like, we'll see the reason why this person's mad. And I guess Kill Bill one, when Kill Bill uses the flashing and the reep reep thing, that's in reference to a couple movies, but Death Rides a Horse is one of them. And there's something about a lot of spaghetti westerns where the less you know about the reason for the revenge, the more compelling it is, and then at the very end of the movie we learn what actually happened, and why this person's seeking revenge. It's an interesting thing to use flashbacks to really tell a story, and it is called the Bella Starr story. And there's just at the beginning of the movie, I'm like, is this just going to take place after she's become an outlaw entirely? But it does go back and tell a lot about her story. She was a real person. Myra Maribel Shirley Reed Starr. She was married to Cole Younger of the James Younger game, and was, weirdly enough, distantly related to the Hatfield and McCoys via her mother. So she has these connections to two of the most famous Wild West myths of ever happened. But so much of her story has been mythologized that it's hard to tell what's real and what's not. But it does seem like she was a upper class person who found her way into the lower class basically by being an outlaw of some kind. But it was
She's
really,
Domino Harvey, bounty hunter.
yeah. But yeah, the stuff in this movie with all the backstory, which was weirdly similar to a major plot point in the Penguin TV show on HBO.
Okay.
Part of
I'll take your
part of
word
her
for that one.
part of her backstory was really close to another character's, but anyway, that stuff seems to have all been made up. There was no like evil uncle or father, whatever that character was. She like, sort of married into outlaw stuff. She was married to a couple different guys over the years. And really the thing that she's most famous for is that she was brutally murdered post outlaw career and it was never solved. And there's all these, it's like a Black Dahlia thing,
Hmm.
it's like the Black Dahlia of the West. And so I was a little afraid it was going to be that, but I had a feeling based on just the cover art of her looking cool and shooting a gun that it was not going to be that. The character Bella Starr is played by Pamela Reed in Walter Hill's The Long Riders, and I fucking love her. And man, what Pamela Reed? That's someone who needs her own podcast, man. What happened to her? Where's she been? She must be on TV.
I'm unfamiliar with her.
Very much a supporting character in The Long Riders, but she's just like rar the whole time. And then
This is one of those stories that it seems set up to be a anything you can do, I can do better. Like,
yeah,
oh, battle of the sexes. It's the ultimate woman versus the ultimate man, and one is always getting the upper hand over the other. But it doesn't do that because it is just her getting her ass handed to her by George Eastman every single time.
and then she does save him. He does become the damsel in distress at the end. There is a
That's
little bit
true,
of
but the
redemption
mechanics
there.
of that make no sense because you want these movies to be like, and then the bad guy gets 15 bullets in the head and they ride off with the gold because fuck that dude. But the ending of this movie is she's like, okay, fine, I'll give you the gold if you give me the guy back. And then she does, and it's like, okay, and then do they circle back around and get the gold back and like say, oh, just kidding, fuck you, you don't deserve this. It's like, no, it kind of just ends. I mean, this is a frequent issue I have with these movies is there's always a point where I say, well, the solution to this, and these are unrepentant, violent murderer criminals. The solution is they should just kill this guy, so they don't have to worry about him anymore.
Yeah.
And now that this guy has no more leverage, then this would be a perfect time to kill him and to turn and to double cross him and to just do that. And there's always an opportunity for the bad guys to just kill the hero when they should,
Yeah.
from their point of view, and they just never do.
No.
And this is one of those where it's like at the very end, I'm like, okay, she gives the guy the gold, and then why? And then they have her surrounded, and it's like, okay, well, why don't they kill them? Like, what motivation do they have to like hold up their end of the bargain? I don't know. This might
Yeah.
be me watching too much Sopranos.
Ah,
Like maybe there was some sort of honor in these in Italy in 1968 that sort of led to this. But like for me, I'm like rewatching the Sopranos now, and it's always just like, well, life has no value, and these are all just like unrepentant sociopaths. So of course people get killed once it becomes inconvenient for them to be alive.
yeah, and that then in Italian westerns, then you wouldn't have the second half of the movie, because like you just take that back to Fistful of Dollars. Why don't they kill Clint Eastwood once they figure out he's betraying them? Instead, they like beat him up and leave him in a basement where he just escapes and then kills them all.
Right.
Yeah, and same goes. I mean, the thing is that these movies have uh, a lot of crucifixions,
Yeah.
and sometimes they are actual literal crucifixions. Usually they are they are thematically a crucifixion. And this one actually has one. George Hilton's character is tortured with his arms at his sides. He is crucified, and I mean a lot of that. I don't even know if that's even has any thematic value or if it's just that's the way Italians in the 60s related to fiction is it was all going through this sort of Catholic lens, this really violent Catholic lens, so they just had to crucify all of their heroes. Some of it might have just been that Django and Fistful of Dollars had scenes where characters were spiritually crucified, and they just all wanted to just do that over and over again.
Mhm.
Um,
And you can't kill the hero because the thing that makes the crucifixion important is the resurrection, and
right.
that's what you said. The second half of the movie is the resurrection. So it's like,
And in
yes,
this
this is
case,
all very deeply Catholic stuff.
the Eastman character, who is definitely the supporting character, gets his crucifixion, and then nothing really comes of it, which in a way is sort of transgressive. I think, I don't know, a lot of the transgressive and subversive things about this movie, I'm not sure what's on purpose and what isn't. I know a lot of it's on purpose, though. I give her a lot of credit for what she's doing here. But there are some things that are maybe just a weird choice, and it just works with what else is going on, and so you just take it as it is. But I do think that Elsa Martinelli is fucking great in this movie, and she reminds me a bit of Diana Rigg. And then I looked, and I'm like, why do I know her from? I know her from all sorts of shit, and she's just like the kind of actress who sort of just is a cool person in a movie, and you kind of forget. She's in Fulci's Perversion Story, which is a really amusing giallo. She's in Orson Welles' The Trial, which is just fantastic Franz Kafka movie. And she's in The 10th Victim, which is a really funny sort of death game thing that I covered on one of the other podcasts. And she's in Blood and Roses, which I haven't seen, but is, one of the first lesbian vampire movies ever made. And I think she's a pretty good action hero, honestly. I think that she just has that cool vibe
Mm-hmm.
going on, and I think that the scene where they're stealing stuff, they have to do it all silently, the heist scene, and there's a genuinely fucking great scene where they turn on each other and they have to have a fight to the death as quietly as possible so that they don't alert the guards. And it's a really good scene that I wish I can't believe I haven't seen that in more heist movies, because there's all sorts of every heist movie has somebody, one group of people betray the other group of people, but I don't think I've ever seen it happen where it happens during the heist and they have to be quiet, they aren't just shooting each other.
That is a cool. I did hope for more from the heist. I was just sort of like, this doesn't make too much sense or whatever. But like,
No, the
that is a
heist,
cool aspect.
the yeah, you're right, the mechanics of the heist don't really make sense. It's I think it's a third movie. I think there's three of these movies where they go in through the chimney to do a heist. Uh, and I don't know, I grew up in the Southwest. I didn't grow up in the Southwest of this era, but I don't know how many chimneys were on these buildings. I guess they had to, because you had to cook inside, and you had to have a chimney for that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that
I
makes sense.
accidentally said George Hilton was the other man. It's Robert Woods is the other man, not George Hilton. He's another guy who's a sort of Euro Western OG, who's in the Seven Guns for the McGregors, that came out just barely before, or around or just before Fistful of Dollars. He had, I counted 16 westerns, and we are watching what I would say are his two best ones. He still acts. He was just in something this year. The only other thing I have to say about this is that it is borderline a musical. The actress sings her own uh, theme song, No Time for Love. And there is one moment where they stop the movie so she can sing. It might be the same song. I actually didn't write a note which, if she's singing the same song or a different song, but they do stop the movie for a minute for her to strum out the song on a guitar and sing a song. So, almost a Western musical,
And
borderline.
yeah, my only other note is that I really did like the shootout in the saloon, like the sort of lights out shootout that she has.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
That
and
was me talking about her being a badass. Like, I
yeah,
bought every instance of that.
yeah, and then you get the great little button at the end where it's like, after all of that goes down, that's when she takes off her hat, and it's like, she's a beautiful woman, but for whatever reason, when her long hair is under her hat, they're just like, hey, you boy,
You boy, you
it's
stunningly
Mulan rules.
attractive, you stunningly attractive boy.
Yeah. But I did think that shootout was good, which is, I'm always looking for, if these are going to be more action oriented films, I am always looking for the action to be well done, and in that case, it was.
Okay, so let's move on to Johnny Hamlet, Italian,
Quella sporca storia nel West.
which is the dirty story of the West. And I have a poster in my living room for this under the title The Wild and the Dirty. And then the German Blu-ray I own is Django, Die Totengraber warten schon, which is Django, the Gravediggers Are Waiting, which is a pretty cool title. But Johnny Hamlet's the best title because this is Hamlet, sort of.
Because Johnny Hamlet sounds like an insult that James
Look at it.
Gandolfini would say in The Sopranos. He's
Look at it,
Johnny Hamlet
Johnny.
over here.
Fucking Johnny Hamlet, and he's always talking. This is directed by the great Enzo G. Castellari, whose given name is Enzo Gorlami. So now you get the joke in Inglourious Bastards. He is the king of Italian action. Like, I guess technically I consider Sergio Leone the best action director of all those guys, but he didn't do that many movies, and Castellari did a million movies, and they all have great action. And he was spaghetti westerns, macaroni combat is what they call the World War II movies, and he did the best of the Escape from New York ripoffs. I think he might be the most consistently good director of the period. Again, other than Leone, who I just don't think we should count him in that kind of thing, because Leone didn't work as tirelessly as some of these guys did. Leone would have like one movie every other year tops.
He had like an international auteurs schedule where he was just sort of like, it's an event when I drop my movie.
Yeah, whereas most of these guys are like, oh, I made 14 movies last year, no biggie. No, I mean, this is actually one of 2 Castellari movies we're covering, and I think he did one more this year. I'm not going to look at my list right now, but I think he actually did 3 westerns this year. So, I mean, I don't have to tell you too much about this plot because it is, for the most part, Hamlet.
To an extent. I think the third act is where it departs completely. That to me, by the way, is I like that they are able to tell the audience right away, hey, this is Hamlet. It opens with this like really great dream sequence where it's this smoky nether realm where the character, and it's Johnny Hamlin is the name of the they didn't go so far as to actually name the character Hamlet, but Johnny is, he's having a dream about his dead dad, and he knows that his dad was murdered, and he's a returning Civil War veteran. And so you have that part of Hamlet, and then he wakes up and there's just this very strange person on the beach doing the Hamlet soliloquy of to be or not to be, while a clown sort of dances around behind.
Like,
you're like,
it's like a Fellini movie all of a sudden. It's crazy.
And then you go, wait a second, what is happening? And then you're like, oh, it's an acting troupe. It's like, it's very funny that it's a telling of Hamlet in a world where Hamlet exists as like the play Hamlet, like the major work. But the thing I like about this movie is that it gets all of the fatalism and the sort of doomed hero's quest that you going into it, that it's like, okay, there's sort of this feeling of inevitability about everything, but it's not so slavish that you're sort of just waiting for it to hit all of the beats of Hamlet in order. And I should say, I'm not a scholar of Shakespeare or anything. Like, I couldn't necessarily, there's probably references to Hamlet in this that I missed because it's just like, oh yeah, I've seen an adaptation of Hamlet once or whatever. But the general arc of the story is so famous that it gets that like sense of, where this is going, and you get that sort of suspense and sense of doom. But then it's not so slavish that you aren't actually following it as a story once he gets home and he sees that his uncle has taken up with his mom because the ranch was in his mom's name. And then it becomes this like detective story where he knows that his uncle killed his father, but he doesn't yet know why or like who helped him. And so he's slowly like sort of lurking around the edges, and everyone has reasons to mistrust him and to fear him. But it's not like a spaghetti Western where you're like, well, why don't they just kill him? Because it's like, well, no, he hasn't broken any laws or anything. And so there's just this like growing sense of tension as he tries to uncover this plot involving like gold from Texas that was going to be sent to the Confederacy and that sort of thing.
I'll set up what there's Alex Cox has a version of the backstory behind this movie that I'm not sure is true because he doesn't cite any sources, but he claims that it was originally Sergio Corbucci's idea, and that he was in talks to hire Anthony Perkins as Johnny, and that Corbucci, quote, lost interest, and the producers offered the project to Franco Rossetti, who wrote Django Prepare a Coffin, The Unholy Four, and others that we talked about here. But then the producers picked Andrea Giordana, who had starred in The Dirty Outlaws the year before, and Rossetti did not want to work with him again. And because he claimed he was inexperienced around horses and guns, which I guess is a problem. And I guess the producers were really hot on him, so they fired Rossetti, and then they brought on Castellari, who is a huge. I've seen The Dirty Outlaws; it's fine, but like Castellari is an upgrade on most directors. But there's a different account on Wikipedia where Rossetti himself claims that he didn't like the idea of a Western Hamlet, and that it was actually offered to Corbucci after him, who then turned it down. So I don't know what the order of things are, but it seems like some producer was really high on the idea of let's do Hamlet, and everybody else was like, I don't know if this is going to work. The funniest thing to me is that you just mentioned that they have a acting troupe, and that's part of Hamlet. There is an acting troupe, but the acting troupe doesn't do what they do in Hamlet. There's no last act faux play to reveal things. The acting troupe is, they come into town later, and it just becomes part of the murder mystery when he's kind of has a relationship with one of them, sort of, and she gets killed because she knows too much. And then they never appear again in the movie. So it's like someone had a checklist of things that happen in Hamlet.
Right.
And then
And
sort of
one of those things, because it's spaghetti Western, is that they fell in love with was the gravedigger. So instead of one gravedigger scene, this movie is like 30-40% gravedigger scenes.
Yeah. And it's such a fun set. It
Oh, it's
reminds
so good.
it's like a the film fan of me is going to say it's almost like a Mario Bava movie. It's like this sort of underground cave, and it's lit really colorfully. But the child in me says it looks like a miniature golf course with the fake plaster walls
Well,
and bright lighting.
it's an abandoned mission.
Yeah.
So the crazy thing about this set is it's an indoor graveyard.
Yeah. And which lets them do all these crazy lighting and things. And there is this one shot where Django's basically doing a version of the speech but to his father, or to the gravedigger, about everything that's happened and blah blah blah. And he kneels at his father's grave, and the camera wraps around his head, but it does it vertically instead of horizontally. It wraps over the top of his head and under his chin and back around the other side while he's reading those lines. And it's so good. And it's so unexpected. And I can't imagine the impact on a big screen. It must have been just dizzying.
It's
to
a
see that
gorgeous
shot.
movie, and specifically the thing that Castellari does really well is frame shots so that we are viewing everything from like a supremely subjective point of view, the way that Hamlet as a work is like very much about being inside of his head and the sense of an unreliable narrator, sort of a protagonist, and not knowing exactly how sane Hamlet is. Like, this is a movie that is very interior in that way, but all through, like, camera work.
Another good example of a weird adaptation is that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are heavies in this. that attempt to that beat up Johnny and attempt to assault this movie's version of Ophelia. And it's a really jarring scene because it's super dramatic. It's a good example of trying to shoehorn Hamlet into a Western, is that there's this really dramatic Hamlet-esque speech between Johnny and Ophelia that's interrupted by these big burly versions of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and then there's this really intense fight because Castellari loves fist fights. Castellari was a boxer and the son of a boxer, so he loves fist fights. And then Horatio, who's played by Gilbert Roland again, and he's very good again. He shows up, and it becomes this just brawl between everybody, and it's like knowingly silly, like they're laughing with each other. It's just this tonal rush of melodrama, terror, and goofball. And I mean, I don't know a lot about Hamlet either, but it feels really weird to make Rosencrantz and Guildenstern murderous henchmen, doesn't it? Isn't that's weird, right? I guess listeners tell me, was that weird? That seems weird.
Again, it's like a Hamlet remix. It's
Yeah, yeah.
which I
The
think is its
Lion King.
strength. I also really like that this is one of a few spaghetti westerns where the hero just spends most of the movie getting his ass kicked. It
Yeah.
isn't about some man with no name, like ultimate badass who's unflappable and always gets the upper hand. He really seems like he is on the verge of just getting a bullet in his head at any given point in this movie.
Yeah. And not being cautious about it either. He's like so pissed off that like that it's another case of the villains giving him every excuse to leave and leave the situation and not do things, and he just keeps doing it, which I guess is like Hamlet.
Yeah.
uh this is also our first literal crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
He is literally crucified. He is instead of accidentally killing Ophelia's father, uh he is framed. The Claudius character, which is Mr. Horst Frank again, kills Ophelia and frames him for it, and so he is crucified as a result, and his mom has to go save him as she lays dying. Like, she has like bullet holes in her, and she goes and saves him, and that's the last thing she does. I honestly can't remember if his mom dies in Hamlet. Doesn't matter. I understand why they wanted Giordana, why the producers were like, we need this guy in our movie. He is our movie, because he is devastatingly handsome. He's
Mm-hmm.
he is Alain Delon. How you say that name? Alain Delon, the French actor. You know the
Yeah,
guy.
yeah. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but I know who you're
Okay, you
talking
don't
about.
know either. They have he has that sort of compelling screen presence that guy has. Only other thing I've ever seen him in was The Agony and the Ecstasy, where he is an unnamed assistant to Charlton Heston's Michelangelo, and that's the artist, not the Ninja Turtle.
Right.
But yeah, I get it. I get why they picked him, and he's pretty good. He's mostly just a presence, though. He's like Eastwood in that way. It's not necessarily as much of his performance that you like; it's his presence that you like. And Alex Cox refers to this as the first LSD Western, which I don't agree with, because Django Kill came out the year before, and I'm kind of surprised because Cox loves that movie. And that movie is so cool that I really wish we were doing 1967 instead of 1968, because I want to make you see that movie. But if you have an interest in the idea of Italian acid westerns, well, this kind of fits the bill. I think there's enough surreal imagery in this. But I also recommend Django Kill. There's a movie from 1970 called Matalo, with an exclamation point. So Matalo. There's the Fulci movie, Four of the Apocalypse, and there is a French co-production called Cemetery Without Crosses, and then Castellari goes in hard with Keoma in 1976, which was, that's pretty late for a Western, and that also stars Franco Nero, and that is a movie that is all style, and that's Castellari's like he still has action, but that is him being like style pro, and that movie is just this fantastic fever dream of a movie. So highly recommend all of those, actually.
I will say this movie, they I I think they were smart not to try to like fit a theatrical performance into the context of a western. Like, it wouldn't make any
Yeah,
sense really.
no.
That said, this movie's ending is a little bit like, we didn't know what to do, so we just kind of had everyone shoot it out.
Shoot it out. It does kind of just like take any idea from Hamlet and throw it out the window and make people shoot at each other for a while. So quite a long climax, actually.
Yeah. And the also, like, some of the way that that it's staged is a little head scratching. Like, Hamlet's mom gets shot in the gut, and then like she crawls all the way over to where he's crucified. So like, and that's like, she's in her ranch and he is like way out in the desert or whatever. So like, you have this image of this like woman who's bleeding out, crawling like 3 miles in the desert to get to the, like, some
Yeah.
of it at the end there, you're like, what? Okay, like, I mean, this is a big swing. I'm here for it, but also, what? This movie's really good. This is, again, like, Hamlet as a spaghetti western is it's a interesting pitch, but it's not a guaranteed smash. But this is they really followed through and made the best of it.
Not a lot of spaghetti westerns adapt very well known like literature, but there is a Luigi Bazzoni movie called Man Pride Vengeance from the year before that is a version of Carmen. And according to Alex Cox, there's a movie called Ultimate Gunfighter or Fury of Johnny the Kid that is Romeo and Juliet. I have not seen that. I had never actually heard of it until then, but there are other versions of that. Oh, and the score is done by Francesco De Masi, who did almost every single Castellari Western. But more important to you, Patrick, he is the man who did Fulci's New York Ripper.
Oh, beautiful. You want to talk about a movie that references Yojimbo, the New York Ripper?
Oh yeah, basically the same thing.
Well, I mean,
But no, that
it opens with the dog with the hand in its mouth.
right. Yeah, and then there's all the other stuff. But that fucking opening score for New York One More Night, I think it's called. Oh, it's so good. It's like if I have it on my iPod when I drive around, I feel like I'm an undercover cop. And then the main title is called Find a Man, and it's sung by Maurizio Graf, who sings a whole bunch of Ennio Morricone tracks. Like the Choir of Men is often him in it, and then he sings the theme to Death Rides a Horse. Yeah, otherwise that's what I got for that one. Recommended, what are we at? Oh Christ, we have to finish at least, yeah, we could squeeze this in, at least have 5 in with
Yeah.
the intro. Okay, so then we'll move on to another one I hadn't seen because it doesn't have a very good reputation, Beyond the Law. Its Italian title is
Al di là della legge.
And it's also known as The Good Die First. And this was written and directed by Giorgio Stegani, who uses the pseudonym George Finley. And he also directed The Gentleman Killer, which is a pretty good movie. His writing credits include Mill of the Stone Women, which is one of that was a movie released same year as Black Sunday, Mario Bava's Black Sunday. That is another very important 1960 horror film and a very important Gothic horror film for Italian stuff. He also wrote Blood on for a Silver Dollar, and he was a dialogue writer for Cannibal Holocaust. So quite a career, this guy. And I hadn't heard much about this movie, but I picked it because it was the only Lee Van Cleef Western in 1968. And I felt like we had to have at least one Lee Van Cleef Western because he is the American, even more than Clint Eastwood, he is the American superstar of these movies. He is the face of America in Italian Westerns.
And I want to say, I liked Beyond the Law quite a bit.
Yeah, and that was the thing. I was pleasantly surprised. This movie I'd heard nothing about, has not a very good reputation, is always included on those really awful DVD compilations I was talking about. It was kind of by the numbers, but everything was done well. So I liked it quite a bit.
And I think Lee Van Cleef in particular is very interesting in this movie.
Yeah.
Because again, I think of Lee Van Cleef, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think of him as just sort of this ultimate malevolent force. He has this face that, like, whenever he smiles, it just looks evil. He looks super intelligent and very scary and just like extremely malicious. And he's, a great antagonist. But in this film, there's something like kind of needy about him that I found really interesting and sort of subversive of all of that, which is he's sort of like this character who's semi-feral, who is like he's lived his entire life on the outside of the law, just because like he doesn't fit into society really, but he has this longing to him. Like there's this beautiful white horse that has some like perfect lineage, and he like longs for this horse because like he wants to own something beautiful. He doesn't want to just subsist on robbing stage coaches and living in the dirt for the rest of his life. And people frequently telling him that he needs a bath and that sort of thing. People treat him like shit because he's this like very scoundrel kind of a character that no one takes seriously. But then he meets the right he meets the right man who can save him, who says
Yeah, I mean, there's a platonic homoeroticism to this one. It doesn't feel like they're in love romantically, but it feels like this is like we were talking about Chang Che movies. This is Chang Che's platonic ideal. This is men who absolutely love each other and will change for each other. but probably aren't going to have sex.
Yeah. And I do think they maybe realize that the central relationship between Lee Van Cleef and what's his name?
Antonio Sabato Sr.
And Antonio Sabatini, they may have realized that there were those overtones, so they made sure to have a scene where Lee Van Cleef, or they had a whole like little arc about like how hot Lee Van Cleef finds this one woman and how he can't stop ogling her the
Yeah.
entire movie.
Well, the thing about Lee Van Cleef is that his real first introduction to spaghetti westerns is For a Few Dollars More, which is has the scene at the end where he's the good guy in that one, and there's a scene at the end of that movie where Clint Eastwood has figured out what's going on, and when Clint Eastwood reveals this by just playing the Pocket Watch song, and when Van Cleef realizes that Eastwood has figured it out and has his pocket watch, he has this look on his face on the verge of tears, and it's one of my favorite performance bits in any movie ever. It's this intense longing sadness. And so for me, even though The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is his best of those performances, the one he's most remembered for me, what I really like about him is that he recognized what he had. He recognized that his face and persona made him popular in Italy. He continued to make movies, and so he started to pick characters that were a little more unusual. He still plays the badasses in the Sabata movies, but he has characters like this. There's a really weird character he plays in I can't remember the name of that movie. It's one where he plays twins, and it's very strange. But he did take advantage of this stuff, and so I think that this is one of his better performances because he's able to play with something a little bit more.
That's interesting. Like, I guess for me, I have seen For a Few Dollars More, but it may have been like 20 years ago at this point.
Yeah, it's
So
just
like,
less well known. It's because Good, Bad, and the Ugly is such a force,
right. And Fistful of Dollars is so frequently ripped off that it's like,
Yeah, yeah,
but so in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, Lee Van Cleef, Good, Bad, and the Ugly, and Day of Anger. He is evil incarnate.
yeah.
But it's interesting to hear that.
Well, and not to get too into it, but Day of Anger is interesting because it's taking the role he had in For a Few Dollars More as a sort of would-be mentor to Eastwood's younger character and making him pervert a younger character instead of making him a better man with his presence, makes him a worse man with his presence. So that's something I've always found really interesting about that movie. And then Death Rides a Horse is almost the exact same story, except for he is trying to redeem the younger character. So he ends up playing all these mentor types in different westerns that then became itself a sort of genre within a genre of these sort of mentor westerns, and a lot of them starred Van Cleef.
Another American actor in this movie that I adore is Lionel Stander, who is doing like his very best Ernest Borgnine impression.
That's a good way of putting it.
Just another great face.
Well, the idea behind this movie is that this is, and I know there has to be other movies with this plot, but it's a movie about a bandit becoming a sheriff, and I can't think of a single other movie where that is the thing. But there's other movies where a criminal sort of stumbles his way into a role in law enforcement, and I just can't think of them right now.
And to be, to broaden that out a bit, like because he's not necessarily the sheriff of a town as much as he is like the sheriff of a silver mine that happens, the people who work the silver mine have to live there.
Yeah.
And so it is a more broad sort of the outlaw has to defend the good people kind of a narrative.
Yeah.
That was always the dynamic with Jimmy Stewart in the Anthony Mann westerns. Maybe not every single one, but in many of them, it was like he was a man with this history of violence and this dark past, and he's trying to put all that behind him, and he has to sort of access his capacity for violence in order to protect the good people. And that's kind of what's going on here, except he has this sort of interesting dynamic where he still has his two bandit partners hanging around with him, and they're like, this is a really good racket. You're the sheriff of this town. They're all just like kissing your ass. Like, we are when we decide to pull the trigger on this thing, we're going to be able to take the silver mine for everything it's worth. And he's sort of like, yeah, maybe we'll see. Like he's sort of
Yeah.
undecided until the very end if he is ultimately going to walk the path of righteousness or if he will be beyond the law.
And that's the thing, is that I swear to God, that's a plot for another movie I've seen, and I just cannot place it. Where you have that exact thing where the co-conspirators keep saying like, yeah, we're noticing you're getting a little off course here, buddy. What are you doing? And I just can't think of what it is that I'm reminded of, no matter what I do. But the difference between him and the Anthony Mann characters is I don't feel like he's got a real dark past. He's just got a misfit past. Like all of his there's a pretty good heist scene at the beginning, pretty good action sequence where they steal a cash box, and he goes out of his way to like make sure people don't get hurt. Like he's a rascal instead of a
Yeah.
murderer. And
He's a Han Solo type.
yeah, and it helps the sort of dudes rock platonic romance bit.
Yeah.
Like if he was a murderer, Antonio Sabato would not. Antonio Sabato's character sort of plays dumb for a lot of movies. He is a European, and dubbing his own performance, which I thought was kind of a good touch. He's a European who's sort of like pretending to be ignorant of the Wild West, and it's never clear on how much he knows about Van Cleef's character. I'm under the impression that he knows all of it pretty much, and that he's just going along, and he's sort of like Pygmalion. It's okay. So like the
that's a really fucking interesting reference point.
No. The Day of Anger is Pygmalion but dark. It's about a guy who comes in and he tries to take an ugly duckling and turn him into an outlaw, and then the outlaw realizes, oh shit, this my mentor's a bastard and I have to do the right thing.
Obviously, a fascist allegory there about the sort of disenfranchised young man and the person who's like, oh, you know what you need to do is just show that you have the supreme capacity for violence and put everyone in their place.
Yeah. And so this is sort of like Antonio Sabato's character is sort of Pygmalioning Lee Van Cleef's character a little bit. He's taking an ugly duckling and turning him into a proper contributor to society.
He's kind of doing that to the whole town.
Like he's a little Mary Poppins, isn't he?
He really is. He shows up because he's from Europe, and all of the and all the Americans are at each other's throats at all times, and it's all about money. And the bosses are trying to fuck over the miners, and the miners are ready to revolt because they know that they're going to be fucked over. And he just shows up and pretends to be naive as sort of a way to trick everyone into like being wholesome and decent and like caring and nurturing to each other.
Yeah. Well, there's something you alluded to at the beginning of the podcast where he comes in and they won't let the black member of the gang on the stagecoach, and he's
That's
like,
right.
well, didn't you guys just fight a war about this? Like, what's going on here? But he's like really charming about it, and so everybody's like feels a little bad about being racist.
That's one of the early part of this movie where I'm like, okay, but I don't know necessarily where this is going, but like I know that this movie's got some of the juice. Is that incredible stunt where the guy who is forced to sit on the backboard of the stagecoach, he's not allowed to sit inside when they pick him up. That was part of the plan, because what he does is he crawls under the stagecoach while it's riding and cuts a hole in the bottom so he can like steal the cash box without anyone knowing, because he cut the bottom out of a locked box basically. But he has to do this, and so they have the stuntman actually, in these long shots climbing under the stagecoach Indiana Jones style, and it's absolutely spectacular and it's really fun.
I'm trying to remember what that black actor's name is. I think his character's name is Al, and he's played by Al Husman, who was from Waterloo, Iowa, just south of here, and he moved to Germany for a career in B movies, probably because he had more opportunities there. And then the Bud Spencer, who I kind of mentioned in passing before, whose given name is Carlo Pedersoli, Pedersoli, sorry. he shows up in all these movies, and this one is he would be playing the Van Cleef character in another version of this, because he always played the big dirty guy. And it's so against type to have him in this, that literally the only piece of trivia on IMDb is that he is clean shaven in this. Bud Spencer is clean shaven. Yeah, because he's never. It's just it's wild. And then the other funny IMDb thing was Antonio Sabato says that his birth name is Antonio Sabato Sr., which is pretty presumptuous to name your child Senior. Obviously, it's a typo, but it's a pretty funny typo.
So yeah, this is actually a little bit more of the thing I was talking about with Hollywood Westerns, where they're talking about the founding of America and the taming of the West. This is more of that. This is more of a Man Who Shot Liberty Valance sort of a thing, where it is actively interested in how civilization is built on the labor of men who have a capacity for violence, and how once their violence is used, you know, how do they fit in? And so this idea of like this silver mine starts off where everyone's at each other's throats, and then by the end they're having this like wonderful little almost centennial celebration or whatever, where they're just having a fair. That is the arc it's trying to explore, is how this European and his, like you said, Mary Poppins kind of touch brings civilization to America in a way that did make this feel much more old-fashioned and much less typically spaghetti Western than a lot of the other stuff.
And I'll say the score was Riz Ortolani in this one, who did the Day of Anger theme, which was used in Django Unchained, I think. And he is probably, other than Morricone, the most famous Italian composer of this era. And it's funny that you talk about the violence of America. The only real note that Alex Cox has on this one in his book is he refers to Van Cleef's character as a strike breaker. Which he really isn't, but Cox is such a leftist that his foggy memory, that's the only thing he remembers, and I thought that was interesting. All right, so we're going to wrap this one up here. This will be part 1, and part 2 will be coming relatively soon, hopefully. Patrick, is there anything they can reach you these days, or are you out in the...
No, I'm back on social media. Every time I think I'm out, I pull myself back in. And so I am on Blue Sky at Uptown Song Club. I'm a co-host of a podcast called 96 Greers, which is a podcast where me and Barry Lynn watch every feature film with Judy Greer in the cast. The most recent episode that came out was about American Dreams, which is a misbegotten American Idol / George W. Bush satire from 2006 that like is one of the most perfect encapsulations of the sort of impotent anger of the neoliberals, that like the podcast is basically me and Barry going, oh, okay, so this is how Trump gets elected. Like if this is like what the Democrats have inside is like American dreams, then the answer where it's like, oh, secretly George W. Bush is probably good. He's just misled. That it's like, okay, yeah, then you see how those norms produce the current social climate. So we have a lot of fun on that podcast. We go really deep. It's not a bad movie podcast. Even when we're talking about bad movies, we take them seriously, and we use movies as jumping off points to explore other concepts of cultural and otherwise. So 96 Greers on the Now Playing Network.
And as usual, you can find me on the Genre Writer website, where I'm finally done with all those Shaw Brothers reviews and getting on to other things. But there is a very long Shaw Brothers review on there that I appreciate if people read, if they're curious about Shaw Brothers sets. I am on Blue Sky as Gabe Powers, and the Genre Grinder has for the time being, has a Facebook page and a Instagram page, but mostly on Blue Sky and Letterboxd, Gabe Powers on Letterboxd, and my own website. And until next time, seek your own truth and your own white horse, just like Lee Van Cleef.
I know it's hard to smile that day.